Hello, I'm Everett Rogers at the University of Michigan, and I want to talk with you today about diffusion research, where it's at, where it's going, and perhaps to some extent where we think it should go. First, in the case of diffusion research, the messages are new. And in the case of other kinds of communication research, other than diffusion research, the messages may be repeated messages, may be old messages, may be accustomed messages, may be expected messages, may be anticipated messages, but they're not new. And it is the newness of the innovation, the newness of the idea, the newness of the message, that is what makes diffusion distinctive. That is what makes the human behavior that results different than in other kinds of communication research.
Why does the diffusion paradigm endure? I think it's because of what it does for us, the function that it fulfills. I think it gives us one explanation, at least, of how social change happens, how it happens at the micro level through the behavior of individuals and organizations and other small systems. But it all adds up in a greater sense to social change in society. And I think it's one of humankind's puzzles as to how social change happens, why it happens, the ways in which the process through which it happens.
It's just the important intellectual payoff of studying where new information technologies come from, Silicon Valley being one of the places they come from. And there are many ways to study that issue, but it's a different approach than saying, okay, now we've got these technologies, like VCRs or computers or whatever, what effects and consequences and impacts are they having? Maybe more important, and at least equally important, is to find out where they come from and what are the social conditions in which these technologies are created.
In the case of diffusion, if only similar people communicated innovations, there would be no diffusion. That is to say, the source must be more expert, must be more knowledgeable about the innovation, or there would be no innovation to diffuse. One of the reasons that so many diffusion efforts fail is because of the heterophyly, the dissimilarity between the source and the receiver in the case of diffusion. The more unalike two people are, the more difficult it is for them to communicate. And as I have tried to say, in the case of diffusion, there must be some degree of heterophyly or unalikeness between the source and the receiver.
The rate at which diffusion studies are done continues to increase at a considerable rate, or maintains itself at a considerable rate. Certainly, interest in the subject is not dying out, and in fact, it has infected almost every social science field and a number of non-social science fields. So it seems to be a model that can be applied in communication in sociology, psychology, economics, political science, anthropology, you name it, and a lot of diffusion studies have been done and are being done in that field. I think it'll be around for a long time. I think it will continue to evolve at the same rate that it has. It has never stood still. I think if it ever stood still, it would die. And that foreseeably could happen, and if it does happen, it's probably a good thing. But I don't think that's the case. We're continually having new innovations, yet newer innovations. I had a review of literature in my dissertation, which was completed in 1957 at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. And a member of my committee, my PhD guidance committee, had many questions for me about my review of literature chapter. The main point of the chapter is that there is a general model of diffusion, and whether one is studying agricultural innovations or educational innovations or health innovations or whatever, industrial innovations, there are very many, these elements are the same or nearly identical in each of these cases. So that was the theme of my review of literature chapter, is diffusion is all the same. At the time, that was somewhat of a far-out idea. It seems very obvious to all of us today, but it wasn't at that time. So my committee asked me many penetrating questions about how I could come to that conclusion. The next day, as I was leaving Iowa State to go off and take my first full-time teaching job, one of my committee members happened to encounter me in the corridor of our building. This was practically as I was leaving Ames for Columbus, Ohio. And the faculty member said that he didn't think much of my dissertation, of the findings. But he did think that I had a fine book in the Review of Literature chapter by expanding the Review of Literature chapter into a book. Well, I thought he was I doubted his judgment at the time, but I did think about it as I drove to Columbus that night. And shortly I found myself making an outline for the book and then writing the book.
Well, I was teaching a course on diffusion at Ohio State, and I think Elihu Katz taught a course at Chicago, and I think Herb Menzel taught a course at Columbia, and I know that Gene Welkening taught a course at Wisconsin, and I think there was a course at Missouri taught by Herb Leinberger. But there were probably a grand total of 100 students a year enrolled in courses in diffusion, so a book about diffusion wasn't going to sell like sliced bread might because of the limited number of courses and students. Well, to answer your question, the first year 700 and some copies were sold, and I went off to Bogota, Colombia to teach as a Fulbright teacher for a year, and for that year I was largely out of touch with what was going on in the U.S. When I came back, I opened my mail and found a nice royalty check, a very nice royalty check. In fact, it seemed to me that the decimal point had moved. There was a mistake. I thought there must be a mistake. I didn't really think there was a mistake, but I was very happy at the number of copies it had sold. And I began to, it had gone through its third printing, through the first printing, into the second, into the third that year. And by no means was it a bestseller, don't get me wrong, but it has served as my calling card for the rest of my life. You know, you can, let's say you're at a cocktail party and you meet somebody and you say, my name's Everett Rogers, and they say, Diffusion of Innovations. Well, it's as if they know a lot about you, and indeed they do know a lot about you, more than you would like them to know sometimes. Well, I've been talking with you today about the diffusion of innovations, where it's at, where it's going, with some hints as to where at least this man thinks it should go or might go. I hope that this discussion has been useful to you in your thinking about diffusion, and I hope for you, for the good of my field, and for the many programs of development and change that diffusion research seeks to provide a theory for. I hope that in future years we're able to develop even more effective models of communication. Thank you.